It's easy to remember Gomer Pyle. USMC as just another lighthearted 60s sitcom. A goofy, good-natured country boy thrown into the strict world of the Marine Corps. Instant comedy. But there's one scene buried in the laughs that hits differently when you watch it again today. It's the episode where Gomer, trying to prove he belongs, volunteers to lead a training drill. He's clumsy, of course. He messes up the commands, trips over his own rifle, and gets chewed out by Sergeant Carter in front of the whole unit. The audience laughs. Carter rolls his eyes. Gomer smiles sheepishly like always. But watch it again. Really watch it. Gomer is humiliated. Try as hard as in a world that never seems to accept him. The laughter track tells you it's funny, but it feels more painful than humorous. His eagerness to please, his confusion, the embarrassment he hides behind that big, slow grin. Suddenly, it's not so easy to laugh. At the time, audiences saw Gomer as harmless comic relief. But looking back now, especially through the lens of what would come later, that scene takes on a different weight. It's not just a joke. It's a quiet portrayal of someone trying to survive in a system that doesn't understand him. And that's why years later, when Stanley Kubrick made Full Metal Jacket and gave a broken Marine the nickname Gomer Pyle, it wasn't random. It was chillingly deliberate, because somewhere buried in those sitcom laughs was the blueprint for something much darker. And that contrast would soon shock the world. When Gomer Pyle, USMC, first aired in 1964, nobody expected it to become a cultural phenomenon. It was technically a spin-off from The Andy Griffith Show, but it quickly carved out its own legacy. In a country wrestling with civil rights unrest, Cold War tension, and a looming presence in Vietnam, this oddball sitcom offered something rare: warmth, innocence, and decency. Gomer wasn't just comic relief. He was the embodiment of small-town sincerity. While the Marines around him barked orders and marched in line, Gomer stumbled through boot camp with a smile, a Shazam, and a belief that everyone had good in them. He was naive, yes, but he was also unshakably kind. And in the rigid, authoritarian world of the military, that stood out. Sergeant Carter, played with relentless energy by Frank Sutton, became the perfect foil. Where Gomer was all heart, Carter was all bark, but that tension made for more than just laughs. Over time, their relationship subtly evolved from one of frustration and discipline to one of mutual respect. Gomer didn't change to fit the Marines. The Marines changed around him, and that was powerful. To the American audience, Gomer's charm wasn't just entertaining. It was comforting. He reminded viewers that decency could survive bureaucracy, that being different wasn't the same as being wrong, and that sincerity could thrive in the unlikeliest places. He was a kind of quiet rebellion against the idea that you had to be tough to be strong. The show ran for 5 years, and never once showed Gomer in combat. That wasn't the point. It was about heart in a uniform, not violence with a mission. But the uniform itself, now that was something Stanley Kubrick had a very different vision of. By the late 1960s, America was anything but peaceful. Vietnam was raging. Protests filled the streets. Trust in institutions, especially the military, was cracking. And yet, every week on TV, millions of Americans tuned in to watch a wide-eyed private fumble his way through boot camp with nothing but optimism and a drawl. It almost didn't make sense. Gomer Pyle. USMC existed in a strange bubble. While young men were being drafted and sent into real combat zones overseas, the show made military life look clean, structured, and even heartwarming. There were no bullets, no enemies, no moral questions. Just Gomer, Carter, and a never-ending series of innocent misunderstandings. This wasn't ignorance. It was intentional. The show's creators and network executives wanted Gomer Pyle to be an escape. They kept war completely off-screen, never referencing current events. To them, the show wasn't about the military. It was about character, and audiences responded to that. They didn't want to see the headlines reflected in their sitcoms. They wanted relief from them. But the cultural disconnect couldn't be ignored forever. By the time Gomer Pyle ended in 1969, America had changed. The same country that once embraced innocence was now drowning in disillusionment. And that's what makes what happened next so disturbing. Years later, Stanley Kubrick reached back to that old sitcom, not for comedy, but for something far darker. He plucked the name Gomer Pyle out of its safe, sanitized past, and threw it into the nightmare of Full Metal Jacket. And suddenly, that harmless smile from the 60s took on a haunting new meaning. Because in real life, not every misfit gets a happy ending. In 1987, Stanley Kubrick released Full Metal Jacket, and it shook audiences to their core. The film's opening half, set in a brutal Marine boot camp, introduced a character who would leave an unforgettable impression, Leonard Lawrence. Overweight, slow, and emotionally fragile, he quickly earned a cruel nickname from his drill instructor, Gomer Pyle. But this wasn't the lovable goofball from television. This Gomer Pyle wasn't clumsy in a cute way. He was broken from the start. And Kubrick knew exactly what he was doing with that name. By borrowing Gomer Pyle from the sunny sitcom, Kubrick wasn't just being ironic. He was drawing a line between the fantasy of military life Americans had grown up watching and the dark reality so many had lived through. The name became a twisted echo. What used to symbolize innocence now symbolized collapse. Leonard is ridiculed from day one. He's targeted, humiliated, physically abused, all in the name of turning him into a Marine. The more he tries to please, the more he fails. And unlike the sitcom, there's no Sergeant Carter waiting to come around and appreciate him. There's only Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, played with terrifying intensity by our Lee Ermey, whose only goal is to break him down, and break he does. The transformation of Leonard Lawrence into Gomer Pyle is one of the most chilling character arcs in war cinema. His smiles turn into vacant stares. His spirit, once eager, erodes into silence. The same qualities that made sitcom Gomer endearing, his softness, his awkwardness, his need to belong, become fatal flaws in Kubrick's world. It was no accident. Kubrick used that name to send a message. Innocence doesn't survive here. And what came next would prove it. Leonard Lawrence's descent into darkness in Full Metal Jacket isn't sudden. It's slow, methodical, and devastating. It's the kind of unraveling you can't look away from, because you already know where it's heading, even if you're not ready for it. The film gives you subtle warnings. Leonard stops speaking as much. He stares blankly into space. He talks to his rifle like it's the only thing in the world that understands him. The other recruits begin to ignore him, treating him like a burden. Even his one ally, Joker, eventually pulls away. By the time the infamous bathroom scene arrives, the audience feels a heavy sense of dread, like something inside Leonard has already snapped. And then it happens. In the dim light of the barracks bathroom, Leonard sits on a toilet, cradling his rifle, fully armed and eerily calm. His eyes are empty, his smile mechanical. He's not the clumsy, pitiful trainee anymore. He's someone else entirely. A hollowed-out shell molded by humiliation and fear. When Gunnery Sergeant Hartman bursts in, trying to bark him back into reality, it's too late. Leonard's transformation is complete. He's not begging for approval anymore. He's already made his decision. The scene ends in a flash of violence, sudden, brutal, and final. It's one of the most disturbing moments in film history, not just because of what happens, but because of what it says, that beneath the polished image of discipline and brotherhood, the military system can consume the very people it claims to shape. And the name Gomer Pyle becomes forever redefined, not as a silly nickname, but as a symbol of a system that crushed someone too gentle for its world. But Kubrick didn't invent this tragedy out of nowhere. The irony is, it started with something meant to make people laugh. When Full Metal Jacket hit theaters, audiences weren't just disturbed by the violence. They were shaken by the name. Gomer Pyle was no longer just a harmless TV character. For many, hearing that name used in such a dark, horrifying context felt like something sacred had been twisted. Viewers who grew up watching Gomer Pyle, USMC couldn't ignore the reference. Kubrick knew that. He wanted them to notice. The connection wasn't subtle. It was an open challenge to the rosy memories of a generation. The innocent bumpkin who once made him laugh was now a broken Marine, cradling a rifle and slipping into madness. It was genius and unsettling. Critics picked up on it immediately. The name Gomer Pyle wasn't just a punchline in Full Metal Jacket. It was commentary. Kubrick was shining a brutal spotlight on the way American culture had sanitized the military through sitcoms, giving the public a false sense of what boot camp or war was really like. In the 1960s, the idea of a sweet, bumbling soldier fit the national mood. But by the late 80s, that image no longer held up. Vietnam had changed everything. The name Gomer Pyle became a kind of cultural mirror, one that reflected not just a character, but a country in denial about what it sent its young men into. And while the sitcom Gomer won over his sergeant with kindness and determination, Kubrick's Gomer was left to rot in isolation. No redemption, no warm ending, no laugh track. For those who remember the original show, it felt like a loss of innocence, as if something good had been taken and turned inside out. But Kubrick wasn't done with the commentary just yet, because what he really exposed was deeper than just one character. Long before Stanley Kubrick twisted the name Gomer Pyle into something terrifying, there was a quiet, almost forgotten episode of the Gomer Pyle, USMC sitcom that hinted at something deeper, something that might explain why the comparison hit so hard. In one particular scene, Gomer, struggling as always to fit in, finds himself the target of harsh criticism from Sergeant Carter. He's failed another drill, embarrassed a unit, and drawn the kind of wrath that would leave most recruits broken. But Gomer, true to form, doesn't fight back. Instead, he stands at attention, eyes wide, swallowing the humiliation with a nervous smile. Then, in his soft southern drawl, he says something like, "I'm sorry, Sergeant. I'll do better next time." It was meant to be sweet, innocent, a moment that showcased Gomer's resilience and purity in the face of authority. And it was sweet back then. Audiences laughed, applauded, and moved on. But years later, after Full Metal Jacket, people started to see that scene differently. That soft-spoken apology, the blank stare, the desperate need to be accepted. It wasn't hard to imagine Kubrick watching that moment and thinking, what if this didn't end with applause? What if it kept going? What if, instead of redemption, that kind of blind obedience led somewhere darker? Kubrick's version of Gomer Pyle didn't get a chance to say, "I'll do better next time." His smile turned into a dead stare. His humiliation boiled into violence. And the innocence we once laughed at became something much more fragile and dangerous. The sitcom never meant to tell a tragic story, but decades later, one of its softest scenes echoed in one of cinema's hardest moments. Because sometimes the line between comedy and horror is thinner than we think. In the end, the two Gomer Pyles stand on opposite sides of a cultural fault line. One belonged to a simpler world, a sitcom America where war could be background noise and military life was full of slapstick and lessons learned. The other was a warning, a slow-motion tragedy that stripped away every illusion we ever had about what happens when innocence meets brutality. Jim Nabors' Gomer Pyle was America's sweetheart. He didn't curse, didn't fight, and never held a rifle. His charm was in how out of place he was, and how that difference eventually won people over. Viewers felt safe with him. He reminded them of home, of values, of a time when being good was enough. Vincent D'Onofrio's Gomer Pyle, on the other hand, was a mirror America didn't want to look into. He was what happened when someone too soft for violence was forced with a mask of a killer. He didn't survive boot camp, not because he was weak, but because the system saw no place for someone who couldn't be broken properly. And what made the impact so jarring, so unforgettable, was the shared name. Kubrick could have given his character any nickname, but he chose that one because deep down, he knew it would hit harder. He knew that generations who grew up with laughter would feel something colder creep in. And he knew that taking something familiar and turning it upside down would force us to confront just how much we'd ignored about the cost of turning innocence into obedience. That's why the scene that went too far wasn't just one moment in a movie or show. It was a transformation itself. The journey from laughter to horror, from sitcom fantasy to wartime reality, from Shazam to a rifle cocked in the dark. And once you've seen both sides of Gomer Pyle, it's hard to unsee it.